As we begin to realize the magnitude of impacts of unhealthy watersheds can have, we must now focus on how to elevate their value in the land management and planning process. With more than a decade of experience, Jeff Marsolais has direct experience collaborating with communities and partners through large-scale cross-boundary partnerships, such as the Lake Tahoe West Landscape Restoration Project. Joining us by Zoom, please welcome Eldorado National Forest Supervisor, Jeff Marsolais.
Well, first and foremost, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm not sure where you got that picture. That was a little bit ago, but I'm really glad to be here. And again, my name is Jeff Marsolais. I'm currently the forest supervisor on the Eldorado National Forest. I served up in Lake Tahoe for almost a decade, also serving as a forest supervisor up there. So I'm glad to be with you. And what a rich dialogue you've already had today. Really appreciate the exchange opportunities and the learning that can be done both ways. So by no stretch will I profess to say that we have it figured out here in California. And perhaps my presentation here is going to spur the discussion around how do we take those examples of catastrophe and also start to apply those lessons learned in places where we have had catastrophe, but also had that success in advance that had an effect. So I'm going to straddle a little bit this idea that what happens when the catastrophic wildfire impacts both communities and public lands, but also how did some of the projects that we've invested in, how did that make a difference? So I'll give a little bit more about the history of some of these projects as I go through. And I do have a very small slide deck just to help bring some visuals, if you will, to this, but most of this will be kind of open dialogue. A little bit about the Eldorado National Forest. If you're not familiar with where we're located, we're east of Sacramento, in between Lake Tahoe and the capital of California, Sacramento, and along the Highway 50 and Highway 88 corridors that cross the Sierra Nevada crest. We're really just one tank of gas away from San Francisco and big populous centers of Sacramento and certainly Central Valley. The forest itself, a little background about the forest itself, we have a pretty active management program here on the forest. Some 40 to 55 million board feet a year generally in terms of timber. We're treating on average 18 to 25,000 acres between timber and fuels. We have a very active wildlife program. We have several large wildernesses, desolation and others. And of course, we provide a lot of important water to both municipal water entities, but also hydropower. We have 4 significant hydropower operations that occur here on the Eldorado that feed power to the governor's office and so on and so forth. So we have some, we're kind of one of those real mixed use forests, a lot of high pressure, much like many of the Colorado forests, high pressure for public recreation, high pressure for utilization, and sort of the traditional uses of the national forest. Going to juxtapose a little bit where we're alike and maybe some places where we are different. 50% of the water in California originates off the national forest. So in many respects, we are headwaters-like, but we certainly are not headwaters akin to the headwaters that Colorado represents. And I would reflect that right up front. We're not a water tower for a major water system that bifurcates the country as you are. And so we place it a little differently. But as you know, California and water, the human use, the agricultural use, 50% that comes off the national forest has significant impact across the entire state. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we've been tackling projects, maybe a little bit both in Lake Tahoe, but also here on the Eldorado. And what a great question the last participant asked. I think Cindy asked about this question about WUI treatments versus sort of the other treatments and how we reframe that. And so I'm going to talk a little in context. These are not official definitions, but I'm going to touch on both WUI and also backcountry treatments. And I'm going to use backcountry as a loose term, not a very specific term, but just to reflect that they each have their place. Now, when I was the forest supervisor in Lake Tahoe, as you can imagine, you're in a fishbowl. From the edge of the lake shore to the top of the watershed break, in some places was less than 4 air miles. And so really everything is arguably WUI. And we were very significant in our efforts to collaborate across a lot of different stakeholders and non-government and government partners to really get those WUI treatments. But 2 years ago, when I came here to the Eldorado, much bigger footprint, opportunity to look across the forest, what I recognized right up front was our collaboration, especially with those water providers, the hydropower entities and the municipal. It created a depth of treatment in our forest type that was a little different than I experienced in Lake Tahoe. And so that partnership of providing clean water and working at the watershed scale really stood out to me. And I'm going to talk about some of the things we've been doing to try to capitalize on both that relationship, but the importance of working not just in our WUI areas to protect the communities immediately adjacent to the national forest, but also deep into the forest. Okay, so a little bit like Colorado, I think we're using tools, all the tools that we have available, good neighbor agreements, master stewardship agreements. Much like Colorado, we have experienced extreme prolonged drought. And quite frankly, that's turning into these fire conditions that we're experiencing here in California that, very, very seasoned fire managers of 30, 40, 50 years have said they never could have imagined. 2 fires crossed the Sierra Nevada crest last year. One being the Dixie on the Plumas National Forest with Chris Carlton, and the other being the Caldor fire. And early on, people didn't even think that was possible. So I'll say that, like Colorado, I think we're entering an era of larger fires, more catastrophic fires, and our vigor and haste in doing the work to get in front of that also has to match that. Before I jump into some of the specific projects that I think are hopefully will resonate, and we can spend a little bit of time deep diving. One thing I think we are very similar with Colorado in is trying to collaborate with stakeholders and public across large landscapes. We have dozens of large landscape collaboratives that occur, and I think Colorado does as well, where you've convened stakeholders. We've looked at project footprints in the 60, 80, 100,000 acres. There's a variety of them that are here, both on this forest and really across the state, where we're collaborating at scales of 25 to 50,000 acres and 60 to 100, and then some much, much larger than that. Unlike some places, at least in the West, I feel very fortunate. We have a sort of a sub-regional approach that also occurs here on the Eldorado National Forest. It's called the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, and it's a collaboration. It's an umbrella, if you will, that lives above the individual project level collaborations, and it spans 2.4 million acres. It includes the Tahoe National Forest, which is just to the north of us, and the entirety of the Lake Tahoe Basin. So the idea is, how can we affect change on large landscapes by capitalizing on our individual landscape level collaborations and projects, with the idea that how can we turn that into pace and scale? So a couple of things that are really starting to gel. We've been working on this, TCSI is the acronym, but this Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, we've been working on for 5 years. We've been able to bring in some $50 million of additional funding, both Fed, state, and local. We have a partnership that includes numerous state agencies. So in California, we have a variety of conservancies that are at work. But we also, as Chris mentioned, we have CAL FIRE. We have other agencies. The governor's office is tied into this, with the idea that what will it take for us to solve some of those regional barriers? So you all know that we in the Forest Service, certainly here in California, we talk about our diminished timber industry's ability to handle the treatments on the landscape. And that's really twofold. That's over time, over the last 20 years, that timber industry has been diminished by our reduced amount of work in the forest. But equally, and maybe worse, we're flooding them now with burnt timber. And so the mills doesn't have the capacity, the ability to actually do that work. Well, it takes a sub-regional group that might span 2 or 3 or 4 million acres to start to work on those kinds of problems, transportation problems, other things that are out there. So this TCSI group that we're working on here, that overlays the various collaboratives that we have operating on the forest, is doing really good work to start to break down some of those barriers. After the session, I'll leave some contact information so you're all able to reach out if any of this is interesting to you. And I'm certainly willing to share some of those key contacts with the variety of stakeholders that we're working with. But the key is you have to have those large landscape collaboratives operating at an individual project scale. And that scale has to be looked at, in my view, by those stakeholders to come up with a plan, a restoration plan, a watershed scale plan that includes the variety of values that touch not just water and not just fire, but wildlife corridors and all the other values that we place on these public lands. So I'll pause there because I don't think it's worth chasing too much. I could do 20 minutes on the TCSI alone. But what I really want to do is drill into a project that was done here on the Eldorado National Forest in 2019 that had a marked effect over the outcome of the Caldor fire that occurred this last summer. Let me see if I can not screw this up and share screen here and see if you can see this. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up from Christian that you guys can see this okay? How about one of our other speakers? Can you guys see the elevating the value of watersheds presentation?
Yes, it looks great, Jeff.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I was asked to talk about elevating the value of watersheds to drive land management practices. And I'm going to zero in on a really arguably small project footprint on the forest, some 8,800 acre prescribed fire case that occurred in Caples Creek watershed. So a little bit of background behind this project. The Caples Creek watershed touches the crest of the Sierra Nevada. So it truly is the uppermost end of the watershed. It's only about 20,000 acres in total size. And it is an inventoried roadless area recommended for wilderness in our forest plan. And it also, and most importantly, provides drinking water to some 110,000 people through and in partnership with our Eldorado irrigation district in our county service area. It's, as you can imagine, much like Colorado, the development of water for both agricultural and drinking water supplies, it stems back more than 100 years, and this system is no different. It operates through a series of penstocks and flumes, in some cases wooden flumes, as it transports. This particular watershed transports about 35% of the county's total available water from the uppermost end of the watershed to the locations where it's delivered to our communities. So it's pretty significant, and we recognize that for a long, long time. We worked in partnership with our Eldorado irrigation district to look at the overall health and sustainability of this particular piece of ground. And I'm going to show you just a couple of slides to illustrate what this project looked like. But if you can imagine that, let's see if I can get this to move forward. It doesn't seem to want to move. All right. All right, I'm gonna see if I can get this to move. Seems like it may be locking up on my computer, but I'm gonna continue anyways. The watershed itself, much like many of the national forests, has had fire excluded from it for more than 100 years. So our suppression activities, as you all know the story about the suppression activities and our focus on ensuring that we put every fire out, has had impact over this and over time, over 100 years. I've got a couple of pictures here that would show the difference, but in short, it essentially would demonstrate that the forests have become far overstocked. And we're talking about an elevation that ranges between 6,000 and 8,000 feet. So we're talking high level elevation, classic Sierra Nevada granite slabs that have these stringers of timber. Got far more. Let me see if I can stop sharing and see if I can get this back to something that's going to move forward here. I may have to operate this way. Okay, so here is a pre-turn of the century condition. You can see open broken rock with very few large trees in there and tons and tons of sort of open space. If you look at the 2014 conditions, what you see is an open continuous bed of fuel. And that had been causing alarm both for us and our local irrigation district. And so over the years, we've been talking in partnership, and we initiated the evaluation and planning of this project. And in 2016, we issued a decision memo to essentially burn 8,800 acres of this project, of the watershed. Now, this is the project footprint itself, and the inventoried roadless area you'll see is the project itself is inside the inventoried roadless area, but we have had treatments in a lot of different areas around this, both along the roadways and along the major highways. In 2019, we initiated the first phase of the burning of this, and ultimately, we lit piles, had been doing hand treatments in the area for a couple of years, went in and did the first round of pile burning. That pile burning was initiated after a snowstorm, put 4 inches of snow on the ground, so we were in pretty good conditions. I will say 10 days into the project, as sometimes happens in California, a late season fall, warm weather conditions and wind showed up and pushed the fire around. Ultimately, we went into a full suppression mode and completed about 3,500 acres of accomplishment. So you might ask, like, why are we actually talking about a 3,500 acre accomplishment for burning up in a municipal watershed that seems so small, Jeff? Might be the question is on your mind. I'm just going to jump to the Caldor fire, and I'm going to try to get this back up on screen because I think it's important to see this. Okay, we're working now. The Caldor fire footprint, many of you probably heard, started on August 14th and took us 95 days to contain and control it. It was one of the few fires, second fire only in California history that ever crossed the Sierra Nevada crest. And it was pretty significant, cost more than $300 million to suppress. At the peak of the fire, we had more than 54,000 residents evacuated from their homes. I left a little red star towards the bottom of the fire footprint where you can see there was, that was essentially the rough start of the fire. And from tip to tail, it crossed more than 50 miles across both state, private, federal, and local jurisdictions. A little bit more about the fire itself and why I'm talking about this. Now, I will say some people see, when they see this slide, some see a flying elephant, some see some sort of a pig. What I would tell you is the fire moved in unexpected ways. and it created a footprint that was very difficult and very challenging to deal with. And as Chris Carlton said earlier, you can only use the word unprecedented so many times before it, extreme fire behavior becomes precedent. And at the time the fire started, we were setting all-time fuels, the worst ever fuels condition records on the forest for some 60 days straight. And the fire had very, very significant growth runs. So what you're looking at right here is a progression map. Deep dark blue is the kind of the early phase of the fire. And then as it continued to grow, it grew into the green section, kind of the greenish areas. And the last piece of the fire growth that happened is red. And you'll see a pocket of red towards the sort of the head of the fire. That actually, much of that was us firing out in the waning days just to lock the fire off. But you'll see that big white open space in the middle of the fire footprint there. And that's the Caples Creek prescribed fire project that we had done. Only, again, not that big of a fire footprint, but you can see it had a marked effect over the outcome of the fire. As you can imagine, that deep dark green that expand from the top of the fire footprint towards the bottom, that was the flaming front. And when our models during the fire were projecting the likely outcomes, we were seeing the significant potential for a great portion of Lake Tahoe, a part of Carson City, and even a portion of Reno likely being impacted. And as you can imagine, a small fire footprint like prescribed fire footprint like the Caples projects deep in the backcountry, where we had identified the importance of watershed values and protecting clean water that had only been 2 years in advance. How could that have had an effect over the actual outcome of this fire? And most of our fire planners and our fire behavior specialists have looked at this and believe it, in essence, split the head of the Caldor fire at a strategic moment in time when it gave us a chance to get in and engage in some of the other fuels projects that we had that surrounded this. You all know that when these fires get a big head of steam, they are very difficult to take. And really, a lot of times it's just about getting out of their way. Well, in this case, this project being completed on the ground, many believe actually helped us take the steam out of the head of the fire, gave us a chance to re-engage around many of the other fuels projects. If I dotted this, map with all the variety of fuels projects, you would see them on all the perimeters, but none at a scale that actually had the significant effects that the Caldor fire and what happened when it ran into the Caples prescribed fire area. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. It's a very simple example of it's a very simple example of the kinds of impacts. But I was asked to speak about the importance of elevating watersheds, in this kind of pre-fire environment. And what I would say is it's hard to imagine that projects at the scale of 3 or 4 or 5,000 acres done in partnership with a hydropower agency or with a municipal water agency can make a difference. But our partnership extends deep into the forest. And I can tell you, when 2014 came around and they were talking about doing this project on this forest, nobody envisioned that it would become a significant part of a Trans-Sierra fire that had real significant threat to Lake Tahoe. And yet that large landscape burn, 3,500 acres out of the 8,800 we had planned, had the significant effect that it did. So what I'd say is that this idea of partnering has to be in line with that series of questions that came up around. It's not just about the WUI, the areas that we're having to impact and create treatments on the landscape to have an impact on catastrophic wildfires. They're now, in my estimation, in much broader locations than we ever thought imaginable. So I've gone a little bit, here in the conversation. I would love to open it up and have a discussion. I'm happy to give some specifics. I would just end with this, and I'm really proud of this. we've done a post-fire evaluation with our local county and our local fire agencies and CAL FIRE and our county board of supervisors. And 2 days ago, Eldorado County has established basically their board of supervisors, akin to commissioners and others. They established an Office of Wildfire Resilience with the idea that it's not just the work that the agencies are doing deep in the backcountry. It may be around building codes that we have to change, a lot of home hardening and needs, but that they, in their county plan, recognize the importance that we have to get engaged. We have to collaborate on scales different than we have ever thought about. It's one of those stay tuned kind of moments because it just happened. We were all at the table working side by side with them to think about what does next generation collaboration around wildfire and community protection look like. And it's a proud moment, I think, for the citizens of this county to say, all of us are collaborating now on a scale, and the county is going to take an important lead role in that effort. So I'll pause there and certainly open it up for questions. I know I hit that pretty fast, but didn't want to belabor on a PowerPoint presentation when so much richness is in the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Do we have any questions? And again, please introduce yourself before you address our speaker.
Yeah, Jeff, Steve Henson with Nyman Enterprises. I'm well aware of your efforts on the Eldorado with the collaboratives, and I commend you with that. As a matter of fact, I think that model really needs to aggressively go forward with some of the other forest and some of the other areas with the forest supervisor. So I strongly encourage you to share some of the successes. I've always seen pockets of performance within the Forest Service, and it's frustrating when those pockets of performance don't get applied to other areas like they should, given the crisis at hand. So I really encourage the models that you've come up with, the outreach you've come up with, the collaboratives that have been involved in NEPA work to be effective in the dollars that get out on the ground. So good job. And the question is, given the Caldor fire intensity, what's it look like for the next 1 to 3 years for acres restored, reforestation, and with all these fires at the forest level, how do we get away from this cycle of brush fields where we establish this opportunity for reburn? So given how successful you've been on collaboration, what's your thoughts there on how to get ahead of things to sequester carbon and store carbon?
It's a great question. And again, so a couple thoughts around that, and we're still in that early planning phase. I will say that we're fully utilizing our categorical exclusions where they make sense. And so we have CEs now for fuel breaks at the 3,000 foot, 3,000 acre level. And, we have some key communities that are on the edge of the Caldor fire, especially in places where there is reburn potential. And so we are fully exercising our CEs to establish fuel breaks on the back ends of those communities so that if in fact they get, the community gets threatened from outside of the area, that they at least have a safe exit path through the forest. And as the vegetation regrows, we will have a few fuels breaks in place for us to deal with over a long period of time. We also have a partner right now working with us on a forest-wide salvage EA that will essentially encapsulate the entirety of the forest. And so we've been working with them. They have a long track record of solid NEPA. And so the idea is, can we restore access to the national forest especially where the high severity occurred, but also in those other places over time. If we get another catastrophic wildfire next year, we'll already have the NEPA in place. And so we're expecting by August, September to be ready to issue that decision. And on the heels of that, we have a large planning team that's looking at the significant impacted parts of the national forest. There's early estimates that somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion board feet have been lost here on the forest. And so there's an opportunity to remove some or much of that and try to make sure that it gets to productive locations and then restarts the generation process. And so we have a EIS, we believe, that will encapsulate the full-scale restoration, hoping to issue that before we lose the value of the timber, and they can actually use the value of that material to help jumpstart that. But as you know, EISs and planning scales of that nature take, at least a year to 18 months. And so the idea is really it's a staged plan where we're going to try to immediately make sure that the communities affected by the Caldor incident and could be affected with other wildfires have these fuel breaks that they can have as safe ingress and egress. On top of that, restore open public access where we think we've got good salvage opportunities, but also the roadways themselves become safe for visitors to travel. And then long-term restoration. Going back to the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, so that's where an entity at that scale, so that's almost like a regional collaboration. It encompasses like a half a dozen large landscape, 60, 80, 100,000 acre projects. So when we're looking at the long-term restoration strategy around Caldor, we're going to use the full might of that regional collaboration in TCSI to start to solve the economic issues like mill capacity and like transportation and utilization of the material. So you can't solve that at a forest scale. I know I can't solve that at a forest scale, but when you're talking 3 national forests and you can make some solid projections around how much material is likely to be removed over time, that kind of, industry's always wanted a guarantee of sorts, but that kind of longevity to a program of work allows industry to start to make some investments. At the same time, they have confidence that we're going to be able to deliver materials that are worth it. So I think we've got some things working on our side. Last shameless plug about our regional group with Tahoe Central Sierra. The state has played a significant role in not only helping us at that scale come together, but also looking at what would the other assemblages of 2, 3, 4 national forests look like. And I know they've been doing some incredible planning to try to get us to have both scales operating at the same time, those project level collaborations, and then those sub-regional collaborations that allow us to break these bigger barriers. And thank you, quite frankly, for the compliments. It's very kind of you.
We do have a question from a participant on Zoom.
Carolyn DeGroot, town engineer of Town Crested Butte, has a question for Jeff and says, could Jeff share the successful prevention work they did for the water supply that showed as white on the map, Caldor fire? A link or a report or such would be great. Thank you.
Yes, I absolutely. I'll work with you, Christian, offline to make sure that there are some of those avenues available for folks to download.
Great, thank you. Other questions for Jeff? We do have another question here in the room.
Thank you so much. Rachel Richards, Pitkin County, Aspen, Colorado. Just kind of wondering, how did you get the initial funding for the little gap that you did, as well as the public support? We often have people who just love their overgrown oak brush and things like that, and they're a little concerned that A, they'll get out of control, or B, that it won't ever regrow, or they'll lose the aesthetic value.
So making sure you're looking at the actual Caples prescribed fire project. How did we get the funding to get that going?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we started with the idea that if our municipal water agency, which is 35% of their water supplies, came essentially as a function of this healthy watershed, they were key partners in us applying for a variety of grants. We secured early on $472,000 in a variety of grants, both to the state of California and some others that we were able to use. And essentially for 2 years prior to the actual prescribed fire itself, we had hand crews up there cutting a lot of the small diameter trees. I didn't mention this, but this was a legacy old growth, one of the remnant old growth areas on the National Forest. And so we actually had a really strong partnership with everybody from the Wilderness Society and Sierra Club to Society of the Native Plant Society, and we had volunteers up in the drainage along with our fire crews and our forestry crews doing a lot of the handwork to get those initial piles built, so that when we brought the fire through there, we could do so with the idea that we're going to save those old growth trees and not burn too hot. And I will say successfully, as prescribed fires go, and again, this one was a prescribed fire that had a red flag 10 days into it. It did get pushed out. We ended up fully suppressing the fire. So I don't want to, sort of make it sound like it went all perfect. But at the end of the day, the tree mortality, the severity of the fire, it really did fit the model that we were hoping for. And had made a huge effect, but it was a seed grant really from the state of California. Of course, the Forest Service, we applied our, once we said this was important with our communities and we had some key stakeholders on board, we certainly dedicated our own agency resources in partnership with those state funds to really make sure that we did that pre-work in advance. I will say there's a danger in, so one of the big lessons learned around this is if you have a grant that is tied specifically to these prescribed fire, often grant cycles don't, or grant timelines don't live longer than say 3 to 5 years. And we very easily could have waited for 5, 8 years for the right prescription to show up. As an example, I couldn't imagine in the last 2 years. So we got lucky in 2019 that the right condition showed up, but that might have been 1 year out of 8 or 10 that the prescriptions were met on that prescribed fire before we got started. So that is a danger in applying for grants, and kind of, and after the fact, lesson learned for us that careful what you ask for. It's easier to have a program of work built around cutting trees because that's about dedicating resources up there. But if the accomplishment is acres burned, then you got to get lucky with not having the kind of years that we've all had over the last decade.
Thank you. No, go ahead, Rachel. No. Are there additional questions for Jeff? Seeing none in the room, Jeff, we are happy to share your contact information with anybody who's interested, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. And I commend you all for continuing to get together and think about this at a statewide level. It's been a privilege to be a part of the meeting this morning. And I too have learned a lot from the conversations and the other speakers.
Let's give a round of applause for Jeff.